Good afternoon and a hearty welcome to Congregation Nishmat Am's Adult Education Premier Speaker Series. I'm Yitzchak Cohen. I'm the proud rabbi of this wonderful, unique congregation. At the outset, let me ask that you please mute yourselves. Okay. Today's lecture is the second of this provocative, engaging series featuring prominent scholars from around the world. Today's topic, Inside the Middle East, Entering a New Era, is presented by the world-renowned Avi Melamed. He's the founder of Inside the Middle East. Founder of Inside the Middle East, Intelligence Perspective. In this lecture, this world-renowned Middle East analyst, Mr. Avi Melamed, assesses the ever-shifting landscape of conflict in the Middle East and what it means for the Jewish state. He offers insight into the implications of Israeli policy and for an Israeli future. At this time, I would certainly like to thank and say that we are proud to present this series in conjunction with our community partners, the Ackerman Center for Holocaust Studies at the University of Texas in Dallas, the Institute for Global Study of Anti-Semitism and Policy, and the Southwest Jewish Congress. Wonderful partners for which we're very, very grateful. Please forward all your questions and comments to Dr. David Pedersen at the chat room. And now, my good friends, I will turn this over to Dr. David Pedersen, who made this series possible for all of us. Certainly owe him a tremendous gratitude. And he will introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Pedersen, please.
Thank you, Rabbi. I want to begin by expressing my gratitude to Avi Melamed and Maya, his wife, for who are good friends, have been good friends for years, and who have been gracious enough to offer this program. Avi is an Israeli independent strategic intelligence analyst. He brings so many things and insights to the table. He's the author of numerous books. He's here in the United States on the occasion of the publication of his most recent book, as you will see, Inside the Middle East, Entering a New Era. Avi's known for his brilliant analyses of a very complicated region. He has precisely the background to bring to the table for such an analysis. He has been, in the past, a fellow of intelligence and Middle East affairs for the Eisenhower Institute. He's the founder of the Middle East, Inside the Middle East, Intelligence Perspectives, or the ITME. They are devoted to promoting understanding of a very complicated situation, media literacy through education to empower decision makers to make informed decisions, and leaders of all ages and backgrounds who are involved in this process. And Avi has a blog. I would encourage you to check his blog at www.avimelamed.com. Look for that, and look for his analyses and his commentaries, which come out regularly. So without further ado, please join me to welcome Avi Melamed. Thank you, Avi, for being here. I'm so grateful. Thank you.
My dear friend David, Dr. David Peterson, thank you so much. Rabbi Cohen, Stanley, thank you so much for this very kind introduction, for the cooperation working together to make this event possible. I really appreciate it. And as always, I'm very thankful for every stage I'm given, hopefully to add knowledge and education. And indeed, as you mentioned earlier, this is a session where we are going to talk about the current geostrategic landscape of the Middle East, following the lines of my new book, Inside the Middle East, Entering a New Era. And I would roughly say that when we try to understand what shapes the Middle East today, I could indicate a couple of major factors that are playing a key role in shaping the landscape of the Middle East today and very likely 2 years to come. So what I'll do in my presentation today, which I will try to confine to something like 30 up to 40 minutes max, promise. I'll try to explore together with you what are these factors, how and why do they coincide, particularly right now in our times, what is the current ramifications, what is the potential ramifications down the road deep into the 21st century. So the first factor that I would like to talk about is what I call the balance of power between different regional factors. In that perspective, I would like to say that in the Middle East, history is never history. History is always present, and in the context of that issue, it's very much present. In fact, we cannot understand many things that happens today in 2022 in the Middle East without understanding some basic historical power factors that shaped and shake this region through the region. Roughly speaking, I'm referring to two major axes of power struggle that shaped the Middle East through history. One is a power struggle that took place within Islam, the major religion of the people of the Middle East. Islam emerged in the Arab Peninsula in the 7th century, very quickly turning into a conquering empire, ruled by a chain of kings or caliphs, if you wish. And this is this entity, rather known as the name of caliphate, a term that I guess you have heard in the past. However, as the Muslim caliphate emerging in the 7th century is spreading its influence very quickly, it finds itself involved in a major political power struggle from within. And a major power struggle is regarding the question, who is entitled to lead this caliphate? And basically that conflict is going to result in inner split within Islam, resulting in two major camps. Majority of Muslims that are known as Sunni Muslims, about 85% or so of the Muslims in the world are Sunnis, and about 15% or so are Shiites. Just very shortly to explain, the Shiites, Shiite is a word in Arabic which means a political faction. It goes back to the 4th caliph of the Muslim empire, Ali bin Abi Talib, the son-in-law and cousin of Prophet Muhammad. The Shiite argue that ruler of Islam must be a male descendant of that specific caliph who was assassinated. The Sunnis argue that, in fact, leading Islam is not about bloodline. It has nothing to do necessarily if you are being descendant of Muhammad or not, but it's about being the right person for the position. Long story short, the conflict between Sunnis and Shiites have been evolving through the centuries, and actually there are political, narrative, cultural gaps between the two camps. Even they are both Muslims, the gaps between them are, and the animosity is basically non-bridgeable. So this is one major power struggle that shaped the history of the Middle East within the Muslim faith and religion. The second power struggle is taking place between three different major civilizations in the Middle East. One is the Arab civilization. The Arab civilization gave birth to Islam in the 7th century. So majority of the Arabs are Sunnis, Sunni Muslims. And as I said, Arab civilization gave birth to the Islam religion. By the way, as a fact, today, majority of the Muslims in the world are not Arabs. They are not from the Arab Peninsula and they don't speak Arabic. Just the same, Arabs were the one giving birth to Islam. So Arab civilization always used to look down at those who converted or joined Islam during the centuries following the emerge of Islam in the Arab Peninsula. A major rivalry of the Arab civilization is the Persian civilization, rather today known also by the name of Iran. The Persians are not Arabs. They don't speak Arabic, they speak Farsi. And through history, there has been a very tense relationship between the civilizations. At the beginning, when Islam expanded, the Persian civilization adopted the Sunni orthodoxy of Islam, but then later on in medieval times, the monarchy, the dynasties ruling the Persian civilization actually changed their skin, sort of speaking, and turned and became Shiite Muslims. So you got an Arab, predominantly Sunni civilization. A major rivalry of that civilization is the Persian, predominantly Shiite civilization. And then there is a third civilization, Turkey, that, like the Arab civilization, is predominantly Sunni. However, the Turks are neither Arab nor Persians. They don't speak Arabic, they don't speak Farsi, they speak Turkish. Their origin is different. However, Turkey was the dominant power in the Middle East through the centuries. The Turkish Ottoman Empire that ruled the Middle East for hundreds of years until it was eliminated following WW1. So you got three major civilizations: an Arab, predominantly Sunni, Persian, predominantly Shiite, and Turkish, predominantly Sunni, that are struggling over power and influence in the region. So we have these two major axes of power struggle between the civilizations and within Islam, Sunnis versus Shiites, that are shaping the trajectory of the region for centuries. And now it brings us to our time. And in our time, there is a very significant development. One of the most dramatic development in the region happens in 1979 in Iran, the Islamic Revolution in Iran. Iran becomes a Shiite theocracy under the leadership of what is known as the Mullah regime. Mullah is actually the chain in command or a religious clergy in the Shiite order. And Iran becomes a Shiite theocracy led by the Mullahs. One of the core narratives of the Shiites is the idea that they have been deprived of the right to lead the Muslim world with the assassination of Hussein bin Ali. And this has been a very strong core narrative within the Shiite. Obviously, the Sunnis has different perspective on that issue. Just the same, the Shiite always believed that they were supposed to lead the Muslim world, that the Sunni took away from their stolen, looted, whatever you want to call it, the crown of leadership. And when the Mullah regime comes to power in Iran in 1979, one of its core elements, one of its core inspiring ideology is exactly the one that says, we, the Shiites, we have been deprived, the crown of leadership was stolen from us. Now it's our time to take it, to reclaim the crown of leadership, again, according to the narrative of the Shiites. Guided by this very significant concept, the Mullah regime has been leading a very aggressive expansional policy in the Middle East, rather known as exporting the Islamic Revolution. One of the objectives of that is to regain or to reclaim crown of leadership. The other one is to actually position Iran as the leading superpower in the region, and thus basically once and for all decisively ending the struggle between the Sunnis and the Shiites with the ultimate triumph of the Shiites. And this ideology or exporting the Islamic Revolution resulted in, as I said, a very aggressive Iranian policy across the Middle East, particularly in the last couple of decades. And that was titled by the king of Jordan, the current king, Abdullah II. Back then he called it the Shiite Crescent. He later on changed the definition into the Iranian Crescent. And actually you could see in the map in front of you the shape of that Iranian Crescent or Shiite Crescent that King Abdullah was referring to. A very significant component in the exporting of this or creating of this Shiite/Iranian Crescent has been a concept that is known by the name of al-muqawama wal-mumana, the resistance and the defiance. This is a concept that has been very common in the intellectual, political, cultural discussion in the Muslim world in the second part of the 20th century and also in our times. Basically, a concept that is vowing for the superiority of the Muslim world, of Islamic ideals and norms, calling for defiance and challenging the Western hegemony, the Western values system, and so on. And another significant component that is embedded within that concept, and particularly in the last couple of decades, is also the non-compromising commitment to eliminate the state of Israel by the use of force, because according to that outlook, the state of Israel is a cancer that has been embedded in the body of the Middle East by the Western powers, and therefore it has to be uprooted. The Mullah regime basically positioned itself as the spearhead or the flag carrier, if you wish, of the concepts of al-mukawama wal-mumana'a, the resistance and the defiance. And as we could see shortly, it was very well used by the Mullah regime to enhance his vision of the Iranian or Shiite crescent. A cornerstone in the regional policy of the Mullah regime is the idea of using proxies and agents, armed proxies and agents that the Mullah regime either fund or establish or basically support if they have been existing before. And actually, when you look at the shape of this crescent, when you see this map across right in front of you, you could see the scattered of these Iranian-backed armies of terror, militias, or as they are known by the name of the axis of resistance, Mihwar al-Mukawama. And you could see very clearly that they are actually scattered across the Middle East. If you wish, you could see to the left-hand side, the upper side, you could see the yellow figure stands for Hamas and Islamic Jihad, a Palestinian Sunni militant organizations and movements, not Shiites, but they are part of this axis that has been established, nurtured, and supported by the Iranians. In Lebanon, north of Israel, is the biggest and most powerful proxy of the Iranian regime, and that is the Hezbollah organization established in the beginning of the 80s by the Iranians in Lebanon, and it is mostly based upon Lebanese Shiites. In Syria, following the war in Syria, the Iranians are very much involved in that war in Syria to ensure the endurance of Assad in power. The Iranians sent to Syria Hezbollah forces and also Afghan, Pakistani Shiite militias that are backed by the Iranians to fight in Syria to secure Assad regime. In Iraq, that borders Iran, the biggest community in Iraq are Shiites. They are Shiite Arabs, but they are Shiites. And so in Iraq, Iran was also able to create itself a stronghold in the shape of armed militias, Shiite Iraqi militias that are actually carrying out the interests and the vision of the Mullah regime. In Yemen, the Mullah regime take advantage of a war that broke out in Yemen in 2015. They are supporting one camp of that war, the Houthi tribes, Shiite Yemenite tribes, about 35% of the population. So all in all, the Mullah regime was able to create this network of armies of terror scattered, starting from the Mediterranean and ending in the Gulf and the Bab el-Mandab Strait, as you could see right in front of you on this map. The majority of that axis of resistance, these armies of terror are Shiite militants. But as I mentioned before, Palestinian groups in Gaza Strip, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and some other small faction are Sunnis, they're not Shiites. But what brings them together to this axis is, of course, their commitment to eliminate the state of Israel by the use of power. Here you see on this map, once again, the short description of the armies of terror that the Iranians has been deploying and scattering across the Middle East, Gaza Strip, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Bahrain. Basically, the model is simple, either finding an existing power and supporting that power, or establishing, like Hezbollah in Lebanon, and the Iranians are massively supporting, arming, financing, and guiding those armies of terror. In the eyes of the Iranian regime, actually what they are talking about, they are saying we deployed external armies that are securing Iran in an external circle. To a large extent, it is accurate. And the Iranians are saying we control today 4 Arab capitals. They say we control Beirut, we control Damascus, we control Baghdad, and we control Sana'a. On the one hand, it's a bit of an exaggeration, but there is a seed of truth in that. Lebanon, to a large extent, became an Iranian satellite. Syria is partly occupied by the Iranians, who are trying to establish a military presence in Syria. In Iraq, Iran has some significant, though not unlimited, influence, and the same applies as for Yemen. So to a large extent, we could see that the model of expansion applied by the Mullah regime, as far as the Mullah regime is concerned, was quite successful thus far. In fact, when you look at the Arab media for the last years, the major issue that bothers the Arabs, and rightly so, is the Iranian expansion at the expense of the Arab states. Here you see some of the cartoons showing the way that the Arab world is looking at those proxies and agents of the Iranians, reminding you those proxies and agents are, in the end of the day, Arabs. Hezbollah are Arabs, Hamas and Islamic Jihad are Arabs, the Shiite Iraqi militias are Arabs, the Yemenite Houthis are Arabs. So in the eyes of the Arab world, these are all Arab collaborators that are actually betraying their own brothers, the Arabs and the Sunni camp. And as accordingly, you could see that the Arab world viewed them very negatively, sort of speaking. You could see to the left-hand side this picture that shows you the Iranian supreme leader and how he's using Hamas and Islamic Jihad as puppets at the expense of the people of Gaza Strip. And you could see the other cartoons in front of you. The pictures, of course, says it all. But it's not only about the Iranian vision, expansion vision. Also, Turkey, under the leadership of Erdogan, is leading an expansionist, even much more limited in comparison to the Iranian one, an expansionist region policy in the region, under the vision of kind of like resuming or reconstructing the glorious day of the Turkish Ottoman Empire. The Turkish President Erdogan comes from the hub of the political Islam, namely Muslim Brotherhood, the biggest mass movement in the Muslim Sunni world. Erdogan has desire or wishes to position itself as the leader of the Sunni camp in the Middle East, at the expense of the Arabs again. His ambition is basically not welcome, to say the least, by major Arab players in the region, like Egypt or like the Saudis or the United Arab Emirates, who, of course, are not willing to accept Erdogan's desire to nominate himself as the leader of the Sunni camp. Just the same, Erdogan has been quite successfully enhancing proactively Turkish expansion across the Middle East. Once again, you could see this map in Central Africa, in Northern Africa, in the area of the Gulf. Turkey has been establishing itself some sort of presence, sometimes even in the form of armed local forces that are backed by the Turks. For example, in Libya, in Central and Western Africa, in 2 specific locations, in the Gulf area, or the Arab Gulf or the Persian Gulf, depends who calls it. Turkey basically established a military base in Qatar. The same about of the Somalia area, where it's kind of like sitting right in the entrance of the Bab el-Mandab Strait, connecting the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. And then in North Syria, Turkey, actually taking advantage of the war, basically created a protectorate, a Turkish protectorate in the northern part of Syria, mostly based upon a massive military power, a proxy power backed by Turkey. And also in the northern part of Iraq, Turkey has some bases based inside Iraq, as Turkey is involved in a battle or a fight against the PKK, the Kurdish Workers' Party in northern Iraq. So all in all, once again, similar to the Iranians, Turkey has been expanding its influence in the region in some key locations. The model is a little bit different than the Iranian one, but it's similar in the sense that Turkey basically has taken advantage of the situation in the Arab world to further enhance its interests at the expense of the Arab world, and in some places to duplicate, if you wish, or imitate, sort of speaking, the Iranian model of having an armed proxy on the ground, like in North Syria, like in Libya, and like in other places in Central and Western Africa. And as I said before, and I mentioned that when you look at the map of the region, you could see those arenas of tension stemming from both, particularly the Iranian, but also to a certain extent the Turkish expansion policies. And you could see very clearly the circles shows you those arenas of tension starting in the upper part of the map. You see the Mediterranean Sea, the Eastern Mediterranean Sea with its huge natural gas reserves. This is one arena of growing friction and power struggle between different players. Shortly, we'll elaborate on that. The Red Sea, the Bab el-Mandab Strait, one of the most strategic locations in this planet. The Hormuz Strait in the Arab/Persian Gulf. These are all arenas that have become a very significant arena in this push and shove power struggle between the different players in the region. Now, the expansion and growing influence of Iran and Turkey in the region is happening in conjunction with a struggle power that takes place in the Arab world. This is a struggle power over the path, the identity, the trajectory of the model of statehood in the Arab world. Just to frame it very generally, the Arab world, the region by large, is introduced to the concept of statehood model in the 20th century following the downfall of the Turkish Ottoman Empire. And ever since, basically, there has been an ongoing struggle, power struggle, regarding what should be the features and characteristic of such an entity. And roughly speaking, we can identify three major camps that are involved in this power struggle. One is the camp that is called Qawm. You could see to the left-hand side, colored orange, a pan-Arabism. This is actually an ideology at its peak in the 50s and the 60s under the leadership of back then the Egyptian president Gamal Abdel Nasser. The Qawm ideology actually envisioned a creation of one global entity that brings together all Arabs, centering around Arab culture, tradition, language, history, and so on and so on, as the major feature of such an entity. And in such entity, there are actually no boundaries between the different Arab groups that are assembling that entity. That concept was very popular, particularly in the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, but ever since, roughly speaking, has been declining. The second camp is the Wataniya that you see in the center. The Wataniya is basically standing for the concept of an independent national statehood. In other words, the idea of creating a separate Arab states, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, and so on, that indeed Arab ethnicity, culture, language, tradition is one of its features, but it's not the only feature. And in addition to that, according to the Wataniya perspective, Arab should be some kind of like a stretching a sentiment that brings Arab together, but it's not necessarily to say that they should be all under one same political umbrella, but rather there should be an independent Arab state that are co-dialoguing, cooperating, interacting one with the other in the frame as an independent political entities. And the third camp to the right-hand side, the Islamist camp, this is the camp that actually rejects totally the idea of both independent nationalism, Wataniya, as well as the Qawm. The caliphate that is the major concept that Islamist camp vows for, and in that context, I will bring as an example the most known representative of that camp, the Muslim Brotherhood, the biggest mass movement in the Muslim Sunni world that was established in Egypt in the late 20s. The Muslim Brotherhood and others that are coming from the camp of political Islam are actually saying they envision a creation of a global entity, caliphate, that should be run and guided according to the Islamic religious core the Islamic Religious Codex, rather known as the Sharia law. And the Caliphate camp, the Islamist camp, totally rejects the idea of both independent nationalism as well as calm pan-Arabism. So these have been the major three components that are struggling over the whole issue of the features and identity and characteristic of the model of statehood in the Arab and Muslim world in the 20th century. All in all, when you look at the story of this struggle, as of in our time, basically you could see that to a large extent the concept of model of national statehood in the Middle East and the Arab world has been a failure. It's quite the same picture that repeats itself across the Middle East from side to side. What we witnessed is mostly a continuing political instability, regimes, governments, and rulers that are brutal, oppressive, dictatorship, mostly engage in ensuring and securing their own endurance, a deep corruption that comes along with that, and mostly neglecting the needs of the people. So all in all, when you look at the story of statehood in the Middle East, in the Arab world in the 20th century, time and again, you see the same story of failing state, corrupted regimes or governments, political violence, instability, and particularly piling of major challenges, economic challenges, environmental challenges, social challenges, political challenges, and so on, bursting from time to time or resulting in bursting from time to time of mass protest. The most well-known one is happening in our times right now in the last decade or so, rather known by the name of the Arab Spring. You may recall the Tunisian peddler Bouazizi, who burned himself out of a despair because he could not see any future. And basically by killing himself, setting himself on fire, he actually set fire across the Middle East, igniting the chain of what is going to be known by the name of the Arab Spring. In essence, the Arab Spring is the outcry of dozens and dozens and dozens of millions in the Arab world, from Morocco in the western part of Africa all the way to Iraq, that are basically demanding their governments and rulers to provide them with real answers to real problems. Education system, running water, medical services, security, integrity, fighting corruption, economic opportunities, employment, all the things that in the end of the day, the little thing, quote unquote, that life, a dignified life, is made of. This is the essence of the screaming of the Arab Spring that basically created a lot of instability, upheaval across the Arab world. So it is not by chance that at the same time, the Iranians, particularly the Iranians, and also the Turks, find a great opportunity to further expand their regional aggression and expansion, because the Arab world is going through this turbulent phase following the outbreak of the Arab Spring. When you look today at the story of the story of national statehood in the Arab world, we can indicate some interesting, in my mind, and this is one of the things that I'm talking about, elaborating in this new book, indicating what I call basically maybe this early seeds or the seeds for potentially emergence of a new model of statehood in the Arab world, which may have a better trajectory in comparison to the one of the 20th century. The reason I'm saying that is because when we look today in the Arab world, and I'm looking at the power struggle over the issue of the feature of the statehood, I can indicate three major factors that involved with some interesting development. One is the political Islam camp. We talked about it. We mentioned it before. The other one is the civil society camp that has been constantly and continually increasing power and political influence across the region. And the third one is the government. And when we look at these three components, we indicate something very interesting. First, political Islam camp, and particularly I'm talking about, again, the Muslim Brotherhood that has a political representation and participation, has been going and is been going through an inner political and ideological crisis. And one of the things it resulted in was a sort of a split within chapters of the Muslim Brotherhood in Jordan, in Syria, in Egypt, in Libya, in Algeria, in Morocco. And the split basically resulted in two camps within the camp of political Islam. One is the dogmatic camp, and the other one is the more pragmatic camp. And it's very clearly that the pragmatic camp has the upper hand. And one of the manifestations of that pragmatic camp is that political Islam major players in the region are actually saying today something very interesting. They are saying something that they didn't say before. And they are saying, well, we are willing to accept the concept of national statehood. And more than that, we are committed to take part in the building of a political system that will serve the idea of an independent national statehood. This is unprecedented. This is one of the reasons I'm saying we are entering a new era in that sense. Now, by doing that, they basically can find a common ground to have a constructive discussion with the second major camp that is today playing very significant role in the shaping of the Arab politics and society, and this is the civil society camp. In other words, it basically creates an opportunity to expand and widen this foundation upon which a more successful model of statehood can be built. Then the third factor is the government and the rulers and the leaders. Well, it's very clear that today there is an understanding that has percolated within all governments and all rulers in the region that actually they are expected to be responsible and accountable, and they will be held by their own people accountable if they will fail to meet the needs of the people. And when you screen the Middle East today, you could see time and again the concept of governmental accountability and responsibility that is very much clearly reflected in many examples. For example, King Muhammad VI, the king of Morocco, called it a new pact, basically a new pact between the government and the citizens that actually is supposed to further secure the needs of the citizens and to further emphasize the responsibility and accountability of the government. So when we look today at the story of statehood in the Middle East, one could indicate an interesting development, and this is maybe the emergence of a new kind of a statehood model in the region. The combination of the Iranian aggression, to a lesser extent also the Turkish one, together with the challenges of the Arab world, the failure of the statehood model, the turbulences caused by the Arab Spring across the region, basically caused a change of priorities, a geostrategic change of priorities in the Arab world. And basically, those priorities are subject to matters like securing revenue sources, adjusting the Arab world to the 21st century needs, challenges, and requirements, creating an educational system and technological advanced system that actually can address the many challenges of the people of the Arab world. In other words, what we see today is a very interesting reconfiguration, revising, reviewing of priorities of geostrategic interest of the Arab world. And that process, that change has many ramifications, many outcomes. One of them, which is very significant and dramatic, is the formation of an alliance in the region that I call the Alliance of Moderation. And you could see the flags in front of you, and you could see that including in those flags is the flag of the State of Israel. The forming of this alliance is exactly the outcome of the process that has been described or presented thus far. It's basically an alliance that's supposed to meet the geostrategic interests and needs and priorities of those factors in the region, namely addressing, blocking the Iranian threat. This is one major issue. And the other issue is to basically meet the new priorities, the new geostrategic priorities of those states in terms of, as I mentioned before, income revenues, educational, technological systems, and so on and so on. In that context, therefore, Israel is viewed by the members of this alliance, Israel is viewed as a very, very valuable partner. And one of the manifestations of that, of course, is the signing of the Abraham Accords, the peace agreement between Israel and the UAE, the Abraham Accord Normalization Accord between Israel and Bahrain, Israel and Sudan, Israel and Morocco. It's not because they have become Zionist, but it's because it is reflecting the change in priorities, the geostrategic priorities of those states involved. So when you look at the picture of the map of the Middle East today, you could see, once again, remember I showed you before the arenas of these frictions, the eastern basin of the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, the Indian Ocean, the Gulf, the Persian/Arab Gulf, the Bab el-Mandab Strait. It is no wonder that you will find that in those arenas we could see the joint hands, sort of speaking, or the cooperation between members, sometimes all of the members, sometimes some of the members of the alliance of moderation. Israel, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Jordan, Sudan are joining hands in the Red Sea. There is another formation of this part of this alliance in the Indian Ocean. Again, you could see the major role Israel plays. A very significant aspect of that is the land arena, the one that actually tries to block the Iranian expansion through the land of corridor, the corridor that Iran tries, the land corridor that Iran tries to establish, going from Iraq through Syria, ending up in Lebanon. So you could see that in all the arenas of friction and tensions in the region, the geostrategic arena, you could see how those members of the alliance are joining hands in order to secure their geostrategic needs and interests. And finally, another component that plays a very significant role in the shaping the features of the Middle East, and clearly up to the 21st century, is the rise of the giants from the East, namely particularly China and later on India. And when you look at the Chinese growing involvement and presence in the Middle East, it's very interesting to look at it through vis-a-vis the lenses of the guiding lines of the Chinese policy in comparison to the Western policy. And when you look and you compare the two, you see a very interesting and very clear contrast between the two. So while Western policy is struggling between ideal politics and real politics, Chinese politics is 100% based upon cold calculations of real politics. While Western policy is multi-focused, the Chinese one is laser focused. It's a singular focus, mostly ensuring and securing China's two most significant strategic interests, which are energy security and food security. While the Western policy is decentralized, the Chinese one is very much centralized. And while the Western policy is gradually leaning towards disengagement, detaching in a certain extent from issues, the Chinese are actually rapidly increasing and deepening their engagement and presence in different arenas of the Middle East. And in fact, when you look at the map that shows you the Chinese presence vis-a-vis the line of the Chinese strategic plan known as One Belt, One Road, meaning connecting the world to China through a network of both land and naval routes, you could see very clearly the presence of China in the Middle East in some major locations. You could see China has an harbor, operates an harbor in South Pakistan, very close to the Gulf, to the Hormuz Strait, obviously for obvious reasons. The major flow of oil that goes through the Hormuz Strait. China's only military base in the world is actually located in Djibouti, right next to the Bab el-Mandab Strait across Yemen. Once again, the Bab el-Mandab Strait is one of the most crucial strategic locations on the planet. Another interesting location, and not by chance, obviously very carefully chosen by the Chinese, is in Israel, in Haifa. The Chinese are operating the new modern harbor in Haifa. Haifa has the biggest Israeli harbor, and next to that, in the last couple of years, a new giant harbor has been built. It actually is now operating, and it's run by Chinese companies. So you could see that China is increasing its presence in the Middle East as part of its overall strategy and in accordance with its strategic long-term interests. And once again, when we go back to the map that I showed you before, now we add the Chinese component, you could see the very interesting structure feature from a satellite perspective, I would say, of the Middle East. You could see the expansion of the Iranian regime and its proxies in different parts of the region. You could see Turkey's expansions in the region. You could see the arenas of frictions and interest where Alliance of Moderation are joining hands. The members of the Alliance of Moderation are joining hands in order to secure their interest. Many times it involves in blocking the Iranian hegemonic, proactive, aggressive expansion. And of course, the Chinese presence in the different factors different locations that I have mentioned earlier. So finally, if we try to assess where the region is heading to, what will be the major players or factors shaping the region, I would say that we are likely going to witness the complex equilibrium between regional forces, resulting in, and among many other things, the strengthening of the foundations of the Abraham Accord. I do predict that in this decade we'll see other Arab countries, particularly Gulf states, joining the structure of the Abraham Accord. Another thing that we could look at, I think, as something that is evolving, which is very significant, is the potential emergence of a new statehood model in some of the Arab states, some of the Arab countries, that for itself has the potential to maybe offer a better, more successful model of statehood in comparison to the 20th century. However, I have to emphasize also something that I elaborate a lot about in my book, at least in the case of Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq, we are looking at Arab countries that are basically struggling for their independence, because the common denominator of those three countries is that to a large extent they are under an Iranian control, as I mentioned before, and basically what we see is a kind of like a counter reaction of the people, or some of the people, or the population of those countries that are pushing back at the Iranian intervention / influence. This is also something to follow very closely, a very significant process. We could also expect the continuation of unrest and turbulence due to the struggle over path and direction in the Arab world, due to the fight for independence, as I mentioned before, Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, the Iranian aggression and the Iranians' attempts to further expand their aggression, which includes, as I mentioned before, a very significant threat to the state of Israel. Another reason that basically will feed further turbulences and unrest and challenges is the economic, social, and environmental challenges across the region. And finally, the end of Western hegemony, the rise of China, followed by India, and as a major players in the region that will play a very significant role in the whole complex ecosystem that we are witnessing evolving in front of our eyes today and in the years to come. So here, ladies and gentlemen, I'm concluding my presentation, and as I promised, it was for about 35 minutes, and I'm opening this session to your questions.
Thank you, Avi. That was fascinating, incisive, insightful. You make such a complicated part of the world accessible to our understanding. We do have a few questions already. You mentioned the basic breakdown between Sunnis and Shiites. Alan David Fine is asking, what about the Sufis? Do the Sufis have any role or significance in the divisions among the Muslims?
Well, the Sufi orders do have some role, roughly speaking, in the Muslim fabric, but not as dominant as the story of the Sunnis and the Shiites. There are 2 or 3 major exceptions to that. One of the three is an Arab state, and the other two are non-Arab states. The Arab states that I'm referring to is Sudan. In Sudan, the political power, the major political parties have a very deep root in the Sufi orders in Sudan. In fact, there has been, for a short time in history, towards the end of the 1800s, there has been a state in Sudan that was basically based upon Sufi order. The other two states in the region who are non-Arab states, but there is also a very significant play or role of Sufi orders, is Afghanistan and Pakistan. Two major states, they are non-Arabs, but Sufi orders have some significant presence and influence in the politics of both Pakistan and Afghanistan. But all in all, roughly speaking, in comparison to the story of the Sunni Shiite, the Sufi orders are basically comes in a secondary place.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. We have another question with regard to the breakdown of three groups and how they understand power structure, the Arab nationalists that that you see in Nasser, for example, and the ones who the pan-Arabism, right? The pan-Arabism. Then those who understand each Arab state to be independent but to cooperate, and then finally the caliphate model. Do you have a sense of the percentage of the breakdown in those? Is one more dominant than the other two?
Yeah, I don't have the ability to give figures or percentage. I can say, roughly speaking, that to a large extent the issue of the pan-Arabism, the Qawm, is not any longer a significant player in that formula. So it's kind of like it has its peak during the time of Gamal Abdel Nasser in the 50s, in the 60s, but then it basically declined. It's rarely today, echoed as something serious in the discussion, the political, cultural discussions. There are circles in the Muslim and the Arab world who ideologically and sentimentally kind of like echo that story of Qawm, pan-Arabism, but it's not really a major political, ideological player in the structure of the region today. So we are left with the concept of Wataniya, the nationalist, independent nationalism, and the story of the caliphate. But as I mentioned before, when we look at the story of the caliphate, it's very interesting because there has been two major developments within this camp of the caliphate, and they are kind of like very opposing, I would say, developments within that camp. One is the ultimate extremism of that camp in the shape of groups like ISIS or Al-Qaeda, who actually vows for the establishing of a caliphate, but their vision of caliphate is going to the more extreme location. For example, the story of the Islamic State that we witnessed for a couple of years in Syria and Iraq. And on the other hand, on the other side of the political Islam camp, we have witnessed, as I said before, an interesting process of the strengthening of pragmatic camp within political Islam at the expense of the more dogmatic camp. And I would say that the common denominator, there is a very significant common denominator that bring nationalist, pragmatic Islamic camp and dogmatic Islamic camp. What brings them together, one of the common denominator is that they are kind of like very opposing to the extreme translation of the Islamic caliphate in the shape of the ISIS ideology or Al-Qaeda ideology. So this is one interesting development in that context. And as I said before, I think that the most significant development is that within political Islam, what we see today is the strengthening of the pragmatic camp. And the significance of that is that the pragmatic camp is basically making some interesting ideological shift and actually says we are not any longer opposing the idea of nationalism, but we're actually willing to adapt that. And more than that, we are willing to be committed for the success of the concept of national identity So we see that in Jordan, we see that in Algeria, we see that in Tunisia, we see that in Morocco, in Egypt. So it's interesting development and very significant.
Well, I'll take advantage of my position to ask a follow-up question with regard to the pragmatic camp and a certain incursion into the West. I mean, are they not determining how to work within the system of wherever they're trying to expand and work within the institutions of wherever they might be, trying to set up their position of influence? I'm thinking not only of the Middle East, but Europe and North America as well. I mean, the brotherhood exists there as well, right?
Yes, David, actually, it's very interesting because we see the radiation of the crisis within the Muslim Brotherhood in the region. We see that radiating also outside of the region.
Right.
And actually, what we are witnessing today is a very interesting power struggle within the international, I would say, Muslim Brotherhood. We basically identify two major base powers that are competing within the Muslim Brotherhood. One is the Turkish-based Muslim Brotherhood, and the other one is the UK-based Muslim Brotherhood. And it's very interesting to see how the inner crisis within political Islam, within Muslim Brotherhood in the region has been radiated and transformed also into this international base. So definitely you see the projection of this inner crisis or this inner split that goes across the region, and it has many dimensions. It has a political dimension, it has an ideological dimension, it has an administrative dimension.
Right.
And one of the things that contributed or further fueled this crisis within political Islam, and particularly Muslim Brotherhood, was that as challenges in the Arab world grew, and particularly fueled during the time of the Arab Spring, together with the growing challenge of the Iranians and the Turks, more and more governments and political factors in the Arab world find it very difficult to come with a cohesive, comprehensive, I'm talking about branches of the Muslim Brotherhood, more and more branches of the Muslim Brotherhood in the Arab world were unable to come with a cohesive, overarching, one style policy, because they have different nuances and different priorities. So that was also something that was leading or adding or contributing to this growing political and ideological crisis within the Muslim world. And now it's, as I said before, it's also exceeding the region, and it's being radiated into the international circles of the Muslim Brotherhood.
Yes. I have another question from Dr. Kenneth Price. He writes the following. He says, the Biden administration just announced its opposition to the Israel-Cyprus-Greece consortium to deliver gas to Europe. He comments, this is a big economic blow to Israel and a stupid action vis-a-vis Europe's energy needs. Why do you think the US has come out against the consortium, which is a blow to Israel's security and Europe's as well?
Well, Kenan, this is an excellent question, and to be honest with you, I'm not so clear what were the reasons of that, what made the Biden administration take this decision. I mean, as you accurately mentioned, the story of this pipeline, the consortium of like the Eastern Gas, Eastern Basin of the Mediterranean Gas Forum. Israel is a member in that. Egypt, Turkey, Cyprus, not Turkey, Cyprus, Greece, the Palestinian Authority, by the way, also a member of that. These are all members of this forum, and I really struggling to understand what was the reason for the Biden administration. It may have to do with interest of the US, but I must admit that it's a decision that I cannot understand what was the factor beyond that decision. And I think right now it's further emphasized in face of the crisis in Ukraine and the concern in Europe regarding the flow of gas westwards. So I must admit that I find it very challenging to understand the Biden administration reasons for that move.
Yes. Well, Avi, I very much appreciate your analysis of the power struggles, involving Iran and Turkey in particular. I mean, both of which have a history of empires struggling for domination in the region, right? I mean, I think studying that long history can shed some light on what's happening now.
Yeah.
And one of the things happening now, I mean, Russia also has a long history as an imperialist empire. They also have a long history of engagement with Turkey and the Turks. And I mean, those cultures have a long memory as well. Yeah. So just wondering, do you have any thoughts on how the Turks, for example, might be reading the current conflict between Russia and the Ukrainians, or maybe the Iranians? I mean, the Turks are right there next door.
Yeah, yeah. Well, actually, Turkey is looking very closely at what's going on, and to a large extent, Turkey is concerned for different reasons. One reason is that I'm talking about the Ukraine crisis.
Right.
Turkey and Ukraine has a very strong relationship, and particularly in the area of security, military cooperation. This is a dialogue that has been evolving during the years. Obviously, the war now and the possible disintegration of Ukraine to sub entities that some of them are going to be actually a Russian protectorate is one of the things that bothers Turkey. The other thing that bothers Turkey is the expansion or the growing appetite, if that's going to be the case, of Putin, and particularly in the context of the Black Sea.
Right.
If Putin will expand influence in the area of the Black Sea, that's going to present Turkey with some growing concerns. It's interesting, by the way, to say that there has been some calls or talks about expanding the influence to Azerbaijan, something also that could create a lot of concern among Turkey. Azerbaijan, for example, became a scene for a power struggle between Turkey and Iran. Russia, of course, is very much significant in that context. The economic ties between Russia and Turkey, again, Turkey has to navigate its way very delicately, and particularly given the fact that Turkey is very much dependent upon the Russian gas. So all in all, when the Turks are looking at the situation in the context of the Ukraine crisis, Turkey is mostly concerned with the potential ramifications of that, and very much concerned with the potential, one of the potential outcome, and that is that Putin will further strengthen its appetite and its presence, reminding us all that Putin is actually sitting today right on the south part of Turkey. He's sitting in Syria. He has a significant presence in Syria, bordering Turkey. And he can use his presence and influence to basically make Turkey be very, I would say, tuned to his needs and messages. Mm-hmm. And Turkey, as you said, David, very accurately in a very delicate way, they have a long memory in terms of like the relationship between the two, which were many times during history not so delightful, to put it this way. So in that way, yes, Turkey is very much, like many other players, following very closely the story of the Ukraine crisis. But in the case of Turkey, it's even further emphasized because Turkey reminds itself in the end of the day that Russia is very significant in that context.
Yes, and you mentioned the Russian appetite. There's a Russian saying that the appetite comes with the eating. So the more we feed the bear, the Russian bear, the hungrier that bear becomes.
Yeah, I mean, we already know that Putin is successfully positioning or repositioning Russia as a significant player in the Middle East. He obviously took advantage of the war in Syria. He's took advantage of the war in Libya. He's definitely created himself, and that's, I would guess, that was one of the things, or couple of things, that in the background of his recent move, because as you said, with the food comes the appetite, with the eating. So it seems like that is the case.
Well, I think we are just about out of time. Let me just express my gratitude to you, Avi Melamed. I encourage everyone to go to the blog site, avimelamed.com. Look for his analysis. As you can see, we have yet another world-class, brilliant speaker in our speaker series. In 2 weeks, I want to mention, we just managed to get an authority on Ukrainian Jewry, Omer Bartov, a professor at Brown University, who will be with us in 2 weeks. It'll be in the evening, 7 p.m. Just watch your emails. And Rabbi Cohen, do you have any parting words? You're muted, Rabbi.
You're muted.
Mute me. Okay. Thank you. Ahadi Yeshikoach to you, Chazak u'Baruch, as we say,
Thank you.
for such an informative and enlightening presentation. It's certainly a wonderful, wonderful teaching, and we are certainly so indebted to you for doing this for us and for teaching us so beautifully.
My pleasure.
Our hearts and our prayers and our thoughts are with our brothers and sisters in the Ukraine. And I turn it over to David, by the way, to tell us of a special presentation, the 13th of March. David, I don't have it in front of me.
Yeah, yes, I just mentioned it. Omer Bartov is yet another internationally known scholar and thinker, writer, an authority on Ukrainian Jewry, who in 2 weeks, March 13th, will speak about, the history and the contemporary situation for Ukrainian Jews. The Jews have a long history in the Ukraine. Not always a very pleasant history, as we all know. But yes, look for Omer Bartov, and once again, you can see in Avi Melamed the world-class caliber of speakers we have. Avi, thank you so much. All blessings to you, blessings to Maya. And
Thank you so much, David, Rabbi Cohen, Stanley. Thank you for the opportunity, for the stage. Also, if I may, I encourage you to read my new book, which of course elaborates on many things and provides a lot of predictions.
yes,
Thank you so much, and stay well.
yes,
Be healthy, be wealthy.
be safe. Be well.
Once again, once again, a hearty call to Dr. David Patterson, who made all this possible for us. David and Jerry, God bless you. We love you.
Thank you. All love, all blessings. Thank you all. Bye now.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Shalom, shalom. Bye-bye.
Shalom, bracha.
Shalom,
להתראות.
shalom. להתראות.